So we have a fantastic event today, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes of your time to introduce myself. My name is Tibisay Morgandi, and I am the chair of the Climate Emergency Working Group, a working group that was established last year in the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, and brings together academics from different faculties within the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. And the idea is, let's try to see how we can engage with the broader conversation on the climate emergency. As you know, this event today is hosted by our group as well as by the Center for Globalisation Research. And just a couple of words on why I think this event is so important and what we're going to discuss today is so relevant to all of us, as well as to just a couple of words on the work that the group has conducted so far and is planning to conduct this year. Why do I think the topic of today's event is so important? I think it's obvious to all of you, otherwise you wouldn't be in this room. We live in a climate emergency, and that there is no question about that. But we seem to behave as if we didn't. And this is not just us, it's humanity as a whole. Now, there are maybe several reasons why we ended up living in a climate emergency, and we moved from talking about simply climate change to climate emergency as something that we really need to tackle urgently. And I think what we want to do today is engage into how we can do something about this, moving from knowledge to action. This is so easy, right, to point the fingers at other people, but climate change requires behavioral change. And I think all of us are involved in this. Now, obviously, there are some actors that have much more power than us, but our speakers today that I want to warmly thank will engage into this conversation from different points of view, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say. I would like to thank Caterina Gennaioli, who is also a member of the Climate Emergency Working Group, for putting together this event and doing so much hard work to have these distinguished panelists with us here today in an in-person event. And I was saying to them, so happy this is an in-person event. And I thank all of you for being here with us today. Look forward to your questions too. Very briefly, what we're doing at the Climate Emergency Working Group. We're trying to approach the climate emergency from our different angles of expertise. So the group brings together academics from the geography, law, business, drama departments. And we're trying to see how we can engage with this conversation and reach a broader audience. Who is the broader audience? It's everybody. The man on the street, or the woman on the street, the future generations and the older generations, because it affects us all. And so what we aim to do in addition to this event, that we should thank Caterina for doing all the heavy lifting, is we are going to produce a couple of podcasts. We think we want to engage with the broader audience in this way, instead of just writing a report, that only academics will get together to do that. And hopefully the podcast will be ready in a couple of months, and one of them also will relate to part of the topics discussed today. Without further ado, I want to thank again the speakers, Caterina, and the group as a whole, and the Center for Globalisation Research for hosting this fantastic event, and also send you greetings from the director of the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, Kate Mallison, Professor Kate Mallison, who couldn't be with us today because, you know, this is the sustainability week, there is so much going on, but sends you warm greetings. Thank you, and very much look forward to hearing what all of you have to say about this topic. Thanks a lot.
So, thank you, Didi, for the very nice introduction, and also for conducting with a lot of passion the working group. It's not an easy task to put together this interdisciplinary group. So, again, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm the director of the Center for Globalisation Research and a member of the working group, and we are all excited, as Tibi was saying, and looking forward to learning a lot of insights from you. So, just a few words on the rationale behind this event, which goes very much in line with what Tibi was saying. So, at the beginning, we had the idea in the working group to organize an event on COP26, like taking stock of COP26 and planning ahead of COP27. And that would have been an event where we would bring our own expertise, research expertise and various fields, but then we said we would have ended up learning a lot, but talking to each other. Okay, it would have been mainly an academic event, and again for us. So again, as we realize while sharing our experiences how difficult it is, what is one of the biggest challenges for researchers working and caring about climate change, to be able to communicate our research and scientific knowledge on climate change effectively to decision makers, so to people that are actually going to ultimately make the difference. And so decision makers think about policy makers will need to decide whether to adopt the amazing climate policy that we as researchers suggest is the correct one to put us on a net zero path. Businesses and managers will need to decide whether to adopt or not the management practices that our research suggests to be the sustainable one, and so on. Households and individuals will need to decide make their consumption and investment decision in a way which we recommend them that they should do, because again they are sustainable. So that's the big challenge, and of course it's a challenge. We know that because you can think about and relate to the psychological barrier that might prevent people, individuals from have a good perception, a correct perception of climate change and decide to act on it. Political consideration, many of them that might interfere with the virtuous and correct policy making in this field, as well as the change in issue silence, with the economic shock or shock to society that can happen and can move climate change immediately from being the top priority and agenda down the list. I mean, if you think about the COVID and the current war, these are just some examples. So again, the goal of the event is to learn from this group of speakers, top academics and experts in communication who have committed and spent many years engaging with going out from academia and engage with the public, policymakers, public, businesses. And so we are curious to learn all the ups and downs of communicating the climate emergency to the public. We also wonder whether you ever felt the frustration of Dr. Mindy and Dr. Bibiansky in communicating this imminent threat by a comment to the President of the United States. But we hope to hear also some good stories, success stories, positive example, and hope you'll be able to share them with us. So without further ado, I'm gonna introduce the speakers. So first speaker is Sam Fankhauser, Professor Sam Fankhauser, proudly a former boss of mine and also co-author. Is the professor at the School of Geography and the Environment, Professor of Climate Change, Economics and Policy at the University of Oxford. Before moving to Oxford, he was the director of the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. And currently is also the research director of Oxford and Net Zero. And among, the list of, projects in which we are involved is infinite, as I have to say for all of you. But just to say that he was an inaugural member of the UK Climate Change Committee, and also its adaptation subcommittee between 2008 and 2016, and so I'm sure you're gonna tell us a lot about that experience, but also others. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome Sam, and I give you the floor to yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
No, I think that's fine. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. It's great to have a live audience. We are getting used to that again, but it's still special. Walking in here, there was sort of a series of oh hello, haven't seen you in 3 dimensions for 3 years. It's really beautiful. It's lovely to be here. So I'm going to kick this off as somebody who is not an expert in climate change communication, but as somebody who talks about climate change a lot. And I talk about climate change to a number of audiences, mostly decision makers, mostly people in policy or people in enterprises who have to make sense of climate change as a decision-making issue. But before I get into that, which is, if you will, the slightly more rational or easier or evidence-based way of talking about climate change, let me just put this one up as a reminder. Somebody once told me, or I was sharing a panel with somebody who said, there's only 2 issues that really get people going and where the emotions and the sort of deeply held beliefs are so strong. One of them is climate change, the other one is abortion. And that's really, that is the case. You have to discuss climate change rationally. I think that's what you have to do. But ultimately, a lot of people whom you have to influence, you have to speak to their emotions, you have to win their hearts and minds rather than their heads. And but that's true on both sides of the argument. And just to make that point, those are 2 pictures from both sides of the argument. The one to the right, Britain's economic suicide plan, that's nothing to do with the mini budget. That is the approach, or the communications approach, and I'm sure Leo will talk about that the net zero watch, the net zero skeptic parliamentarians in the UK used, the line they would take to fight net zero emissions. It's deeply sort of emotive rather than rational debate. And so they talk about suicide plans when they should talk about costs and benefits. But you know, there's also a lot of emotions on the other side, where people sort of really sort of feel very strongly about the worry about climate change, and that's absolutely right. I feel that too. But then sort of are not always careful, in my opinion, to stick to the sort of the factual descriptions of what the risks are. The risks are big enough as they are. You don't really have to exaggerate them. And things like, I don't know, I put that out so we can discuss it afterwards. Things like 20 or 12 years to save the Earth, they fall in that category of slight exaggeration. It's a bit like sort of saying the world is coming to an end at Christmas. You have a hell of a lot of explaining to do on Boxing Day, because this is an ongoing process. If we don't succeed in 1.5 degrees, we try 1.6 and 1.7 and 1.8, and until we actually, you know, are able to stabilize climate at one temperature level or another, and any number is better than the next bigger one. So we have to think about it in those sorts of non-emotional terms, I would say. So that's the starting point, and then let's move on to the communications that I do, which tend to be more sort of engaging, as Caterina said, with decision makers, with people who all have their emotions as well, but ultimately want to sort of make an evidence-based decision. They come in 2 parts. One is people who make policy, and the other is people in the private sector who make decisions about investments and business priorities and so on. and you speak to them in a slightly different way. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to, for each one of those categories, I'm going to give you a sort of a very personal example of how I engage, but then I'm going to tell you some of the messages that I have found that resonate with those audiences. And then I give you an example of a campaign, if that's the right word for it, or a publication that I feel has been very influential for various reasons. So, policymakers, and as Caterina said, my sort of most powerful and most enjoyable way of communicating with policymakers was when I was a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change. I was a member before anybody knew what that committee was, and before anybody appreciated that, you know, it was actually a powerful communication and powerful sort of evidence, knowledge advisory body. That all came later. Why is the Committee on Climate Change? For those of you who don't know, the Committee on Climate Change is a statutory body set up by law in the UK to advise the government on climate change targets and then to monitor adherence to those targets. So it's a little bit like the sort of the Monetary Policy Committee for carbon, with a bit less influence, but a similar sort of mandate. Why is that a good channel for influence? It's a good channel for influence because the Committee on Climate Change is unapologetically analytical, unapologetically looking for the best evidence that is out there. And because of its statutory role, the committee is then able to use that analytical knowledge to communicate with decision makers. And it has that sort of road in to decision makers, to policy makers that other bodies, that NGOs, that academics don't necessarily have. We did a little bit of a review of the Climate Change Committee 10 years in, that was in 2018. We calculated some statistics as to who is actually listening to this deeply analytical, you know, not quite nerdy, but very analytical body that sort of knows and tries to know everything about every aspect of climate change. And the answer is, this is slightly smaller than it should be, apologies. The answer is, we looked at in Hansard, the parliamentary record, and say who quotes the Committee on Climate Change in their interventions. And the answer is, if you look by party politics, which is the top chart there, every party does, including parties of government. The big parties, Conservatives, Labour there on the left, they should quote the Committee on Climate Change a lot. Smaller parties in proportion to their seats, even more. That's that light blue part that you see there. And the interesting bit about that is even government officials quote the Committee on Climate Change. They use CCC evidence rather than evidence from their own departments. So this is a very powerful position to be in. And the bottom chart is the seniority of the people who cite the CCC, and it goes from party leaders to ministers all the way down to backbenchers. So how come this is such a powerful body? Partly it is statutory, it was put in place to have that role, but partly it is that adherence to the best evidence that is available, that trust, that independence and rigor that a body like the CCC has, which an NGO, for example, or an academic wouldn't necessarily have. So that is my sort of favorite channel to influence policymakers, or the one I enjoy most in my private life. Let me sort of tell you a little bit about the messages that we use when we engage with policymakers. And one thing you will notice in those messages, I'll do those quite quickly, is none of them have to do with the impacts of climate change and sort of reminding people just how big the stakes are in climate change. That's an important debate, but that's almost never the way I start those conversations. I always start somewhere else. I start somewhere more pragmatic, somewhere that gives decision makers a sense, yes, I can do something about the problem. And one message that resonates very well is, we know what we have to do. We have the blueprint. We understand what the technological solutions are, the economic solutions are, and they're not going to bankrupt the state. They may cost something, they may be difficult, but we know what we're doing. That's a very powerful message, and you can draw on a lot of evidence by now of where that knowledge comes from. This particular chart, which you shouldn't try to read, it's just an example from the International Energy Agency that shows you one of those transition paths from current emissions to net zero emissions. Really detailed, sector by sector, decade by decade. This is what we're going to do on transport over the next 10 years. This is what we're going to do on heat pumps over the next 20 years, and so on. Those detailed blueprints exist, and that can be quite a powerful way of engaging with decision makers, giving them the sort of confidence that this isn't a mad, unrealistic idea. This is something that it's doable. Another message that tends to work a lot is decision makers, policy makers often want to know, does that stuff even work? If I pass a law, will it do any good? And we have a sort of a library of information now that we can use to that effect. We can tell policymakers, if you're interested in a carbon tax that works, look at British Columbia. If you're interested in transport policy support for electric vehicles that works, look at Norway. If you want to know how you incentivize or let the financial sector report back on their carbon risks, look at France. If you want to know about renewable energy policy, look at Germany. We have those blueprints of things that work in particular context. That can be very powerful as well, because it gives the assurance to policymakers there are models that I can follow. The picture I put up here to make that point was just to self-promotion reasons. It's a paper we did. We had 2,000, Caterina was involved in some of that work, 2,000 climate change laws, and we just asked statistically what have those 2,000 climate change laws that are passed by 190 countries in the world, what have they achieved? What has all that policy making, all that law making, what difference has it made? And the answer is it sort of reduced the growth in emissions between 1999 and 2016 by about a third. If it hadn't been for those laws, emissions, global carbon emissions would have gone up from something like 23 gigatons by 15 gigatons to something like whatever that gives you, 38 gigatons. In reality, emissions only went up by 32 gigatons. The difference, those 6 or 5.8 gigatons, that's the impact of climate change legislation. So we can tell policymakers what you're doing actually makes a difference. It's nowhere near enough, but it makes a difference. 5.8 gigatons, that's roughly the annual emissions of the United States. So all that policy making that we've done saves one United States. That's the second biggest emitter in the world. Good start, but we have to do more, of course. Another message that resonates with decision makers is, let's not talk about hair shirts and costs. Let's not talk about the sacrifice everybody has to make. Let's talk about the opportunities that come with it. Those opportunities are real, and communicating those opportunities has been very, very powerful. We use the language of economics to do that, because if you talk to Treasury officials, that's the language they speak. So we talk to them in terms of eminent economic thinkers that they have heard of in their degrees. We talk to them in terms of John Maynard Keynes, who gave us Keynesian economics. We talk to them in terms of Arthur Pigou, the man who invented welfare economics and gave us the term externalities. We talk to them in terms of Joseph Schumpeter, the man who gave us the idea of creative destruction, the idea that new innovation, including clean innovation, can disrupt an economic system, can give us innovation, can give us investment, can give us growth, can give us renewal. We can talk about clean innovation being in the same league as nanotechnology, as the iPhone, as the internet, in terms of disrupting our life in a good way rather than in a bad way. Just to give you an example of how we then used that sort of insight in a campaign that has been, I believe, very successful, and the person, one of the people who was behind it is actually sitting there. It is Lucy Erickson, the head of communications in the Smith School. This is an example of the Smith School, my employer in Oxford. It happened before I joined, so nothing to do with me. But it was really very powerful. It was the beginning of the COVID debate when countries started spending really huge amounts of money supporting the economy, making sure that the economy doesn't tank because we were all in lockdown and supply chains were interrupted. And people in many places, including in Oxford, make the point, but if you spend all that money, spend it wisely. Don't just spend it in propping up high carbon sectors. Spend it in a way that also helps transition to a low carbon economy. And then the analysis showed that a lot of those investments that you can do to reach net zero, all the energy efficiency investments that we need, a lot of the renewable investments we need, they turn out to be actually very good support policies for an economy that needs to be kickstarted after a shock like COVID. The sort of criteria is timely, targeted, temporary. That's a good stimulus. It's timely, as in you spend the money now. It's targeted, as in you put the money into those parts of the economy that are really ailing, that are sluggish. And it's temporary, that once the economy recovers, the support gets withdrawn. Well, it turns out that things like energy efficiency investments are exactly that. They're timely, they're targeted, they're temporary, they're also transformational. And that was a really powerful message. It helped to have a stellar cast of people making the case, including a Nobel Prize winner and really sort of eminent climate economists. But it really was a message that got through. So I probably have to speed up a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit what we do with decision makers. What are the sort of decision makers in the private sector? What are the sort of messages that we use when we talk to business people? And again, we don't talk necessarily about climate risks and the risks of disasters and so on. Sometimes we do, but we then talk in terms of business continuity rather than climate risks. What we say instead is some of the messages like, this is the new normal. If you're a business person, you wonder in what sort of context you're going to make your investment decisions. The fact is you're going to make those decisions in a context where there's a lot of climate change regulation. And that cuts through, because people want to know what is the context in which I make decisions. And if you can tell them, this chart here, there's 2,000 climate change laws in the world. Every single country has at least one of them. If you're in the European Union, the country you're investing in has more than 30 of them. That sort of gets the message home that this is the new normal. Climate change, whether you like it or not, whether you believe in it or not, it is there as a regulatory context in which you make decisions. And that is really quite powerful for a lot of businesses when they make their decisions. Another powerful message that cuts across a lot is, what's the downside if you make the wrong decisions? Just how much money is at risk? And there are NGOs that have been very powerful in putting that story across to the financial sector in particular. They made the observation that if you look at all you probably know this story, if you look at all the carbon, the oil and gas and coal reserves that are on the balance sheet of oil, gas and mining companies, if you add up all that carbon and you compare it with the amount of carbon we still have left in the atmosphere, it turns out that it's 3 times as much carbon on the balance sheets of those companies than we are allowed to burn. By implication is 2/3 on the stuff on the balance sheets of those companies should be written off and is unburnable. That sinks into investors. That's the sort of message they understand. They understand here's a company that is potentially overvalued. Another sort of message that increasingly becomes more powerful, because there's starting to be cases like that, is you will be taken to court. If you make the wrong decisions, somebody, probably an NGO, will take you to court. That used to be quite an abstract sort of concept, and people thought, yeah, maybe a lot of risks out there. But we then started collecting data. We started to collect data about the number of litigation cases there are actually which involve climate change in one way or another. And there's a huge number of them. There's about 1,400 cases like that. About 1,000 of them are in the US. And there are a lot of operational things, like I haven't got planning permission for my wind farm, or I haven't got permits in my emissions trading scheme. But a fair amount of them are sort of strategic cases that change the direction of a company, like a case that you will all be familiar with. Shell was taken to court by NGOs, and against most people's expectations, the NGOs won. And that sort of, again, focuses decision makers, that focuses private sector investors. And evidence about just how real that risk is can be quite powerful. But then you want to tell the positive story again. You want to tell, again, not just the story of the risk, but the story of the opportunities. And again, we collected a lot of data. This time, we actually used other people's data. FTSE Russell, the index provider, with a little bit of help from some of us, started to calculate what is the share of revenues in all the listed companies in the world. Which share of their revenues could you call green? And it turns out a lot of revenue, about 20% of revenue in all listed companies, you could call green. And then, you find it in diverse companies. They do a lot of their mainstream stuff, but there's the little department that you could call green. You find that green niche even in oil and gas company. Halliburton, one of the biggest supply companies for the oil and gas industry. They happen to be good at drilling holes, therefore they're also good at geothermal, they're also good at carbon capture, so they have a little bit of part of the green economy. And being able to tell investors that if you add up all that green revenue, it adds up to about an economic sector that is the size of the current oil and gas industry. Those are the sort of investment opportunities, investment insights that private decision makers find interesting and respond to. Let me give you an example again of a campaign. Again, it's an Oxford one that happened before I joined the Smith School, a campaign that really resonated, and that's the story about greenwashing. A lot of companies these days have net zero targets. They understand the importance of climate change, so they commit to net zero. Then they don't fully know how they want to do it, and they resort to carbon offsetting. They say, we will continue to emit, but we will offset those emissions. We will plant trees or something like that. And we, colleagues in Oxford, sat down and said, yes, offsetting is a good thing, but if you want to be credible about offsetting, here are a couple of things you have to do. You have to reduce your emissions first before you resort to offsetting. If you do offset, make sure that those offsets are permanent. If you plant a tree and that forest eventually dies, then you haven't reduced your emissions, or at least only temporarily. There's a good example on that. Coldplay, the band, wanted to have a carbon-free tour it's quite a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago. So they planted a lot of trees, and they had their carbon-free tour. And then a couple of years later, people went back and looked at the forest, and the saplings had all died. So it wasn't actually a carbon-free tour at all. And going to people with examples like that and telling them, here's some very simple common sense steps of how you can avoid greenwashing and do genuine emission reductions, has turned out to be unbelievably powerful. The reason is because people do want to do the right thing, but they need to be told just how one does it, and they need to be told it can be done, and there are benefits associated with it. Let me stop here. So that was my ramblings about talking to decision makers in the public sector and in the private sector, and I'm sure we will talk more about decision makers in the public as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. So unless you have a very pressing question for Sam, I suggest I introduce the next speaker, and we'll collect all the questions during the panel. Okay, so we have Candice Howarth now. So Candice, she's the head of local climate action at the also at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment at the LSE, and she's also co-director of the Place-Based Climate Action Network. She has worked in UK government as a civil servant in what was called the DEC, so Department of Energy and Climate Change, and he advised several UK and international organizations. And she also had like a a few years as a senior lecturer in academia, and now you're really into trying really to spread the knowledge and communicate that. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot of insight from you as well. Please, Candice, yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have a bit of a hard act to follow, so please bear with me. But thank you very much for that introduction. So I work at the Alyssa Gilbert Institute, and I did do my PhD about 10 years ago on communication of climate change and behaviour change. So I've veered more into policy and social sciences over the last few years, but hopefully I can delve into some of the insights that I've gained over the years. What I want to do in my presentation, in the short time that I have, I want to talk you through a couple of examples of work that I'm involved in that directly looks at the translation of evidence to inform decision making. I'll do this by looking at the Pecan Commission, so the Place-Based Climate Action Network, but also some of the work that we're doing at the moment looking at the integration of adaptation and mitigation and the extent to which communicating this might be able to help further galvanize change. Now, just a little bit of context around the communication of climate change. I'm sure many of you know this already, but it's crucial to get an understanding, as Sam's already alluded to, of the perceptions that people hold when it comes to climate change in order to develop effective communication approaches. And the way in which perceptions have evolved over time has shifted quite dramatically in some instances. But we do know that by the mid-2000s, the public across the globe was pretty much aligned with the understanding that climate change was happening. It was an important issue, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. So there was this broad popular consensus for climate change. And alongside that, there was growing scientific evidence and knowledge. So the two were there. But what seemed to happen towards the late 2000s and early 2010s was a growing movement of climate skepticism as well internationally. So this demonstrates that even though public perceptions and scientific knowledge on climate change was quite high, skepticism was also on the rise. So this goes beyond the need for information and evidence on climate change. As Sam's already alluded to, there are other attributes, other factors that are at play which mean information and evidence on climate change can be interpreted in different ways, and hence action on the issue may or may not happen. And we tend to look at this through the lens of the information deficit model, which assumes that by giving people more and more information about climate change, then automatically they'll change their behaviour, right? And they'll inform their decision-making practices. But we know that isn't true. We know that isn't the case, not just at the organisational or political level, but at the individual level. And it's important to remember that many of the audiences that we engage with are individuals, they are people. And this is why many of the projects or much of the work that goes into communicating climate change has to be very tailored to those specific audiences. You can't engage with policymakers in the same way you engage with members of the public, and so forth. And through a lot of the work that we've been doing through Pecan, we're looking at this through the lens of co-production and the bringing together multiple stakeholders with different views, different perceptions, different interests and different priorities to try to gain a sense of the ways in which the communication of climate change can address concerns and interests that they all have, so that we can come up with unified solutions to the climate problem. I just wanted to list a few of the factors and the variables that do influence the way in which climate change is communicated and climate change information is received. Now, the first is obviously perception, which I've spoken a lot about, and people's perceptions about climate change can actually shift depending on the role that they themselves have. So, for example, I'm talking to you in a professional capacity right now, but my perceptions may shift when I go home. So the personal versus professional capacities in which we engage with the topic can shift quite dramatically. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. The way in which people's values are framed and their worldviews will also affect the way in which they filter the information that they receive or that they seek out. And motivated reasoning in particular is this concept where people actually seek out specific information that will support their beliefs and exclude other information that might contradict it. So we do tend to see this quite a bit. And then mass media communication, which I'm sure Leo will speak a lot about in his presentation, does also inform and influence the way in which people receive information and the way in which they're going to interpret that and use that in different ways. And then weather and weather events as well. Evidence has suggested that the way in which people experience different types of weather, whether it might be extreme cold or heat, can influence their perceptions and their knowledge and understanding of whether or not climate change is happening, whether or not it's affecting them, or whether or not anything needs to be done. So understanding these is really crucial to ensure that both the design and the implementation of different communication approaches really addresses the needs of different audiences to maximise the uptake and to hopefully constructively inform decision-making processes. So different messages on climate change will be received and interpreted differently, and this isn't just due to the information itself, but it's for the range of variables that I've outlined, and also the ways in which people take that information and interpret it within the specific setting that they're going to be using that information. And alongside that, communication alone is not the only tool and can't be the only tool to influence behaviour change or change in general. Communication is a really important component of it, but it needs to come alongside a variety of other approaches. Now, what tends to happen with communication, as I mentioned earlier, is this information deficit approach and this linear approach of sharing information, communicating information to a specific audience in the hope that that is enough for them to get them to change. But what we find actually is that you need to involve a variety of different actors, not just in the dissemination and reception of the information, but also in the co-creation of the evidence to make sure it's very much aligned with evidence available and evidence needs of policy issues. And then going even beyond that and involving as many stakeholders as possible to ensure, although you end up getting quite a complex and complicated system, but not only the evidence you're producing, but the evidence that you're using is aligned with a variety of stakeholders who will be involved in decision-making processes around climate change. And this is where I want to introduce Pecan, the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which is an ESRC-funded network. It was for 5 years. We've got about a year left in our funding. It's £3.5 million, and it's all about translating climate knowledge and evidence into action on the ground. And we do this in predominantly 3 locations, in Belfast, Leeds and Edinburgh. But we also have an outer network of commissions. I think we'd originally said in our application for funding that we would try and have an additional 1 or 2 commissions by the end of the project. But our outer network of commissions is now about 16 commissions, could be 17. So there's huge interest in the model of a climate commission. And we're actually conducting an evaluation of the impact of the commissions and the extent to which they're actually directly informing decision making. And we have these commissions not just at the city scale, we also have a regional one, and we have them dotted all over the country. And across the work of Pecan, in addition to the climate city commissions, we're also doing work around financing climate change action and adaptation, which I'll come back to. Now, for those of you who may not know much about the concept of a climate commission, this was a fairly new concept to me as well when I joined the project, but they are actually inspired and informed by the way in which the Climate Change Committee, which Sam has already spoken about, they are seen as independent voices, and this is actually one of the key positive aspects of the Commission, that they maintain this independence from, say, the local council, which many of them are associated with. So they provide this independent voice, but each commission has actually evolved quite differently. The Leeds Commission was established just before Pecan started, and then Belfast and Edinburgh was established soon after. And then the other commissions established in their own way. And we may or may not have been directly or less directly involved in their establishment, but we provide a supportive Pecan Plus network, which helps with the knowledge exchange side of things, that each of the individual commissions are learning from each other in terms of how they might be using evidence that's available to them, translating that in a way that can then be used and deployed by some of their commissioners who might work on different political areas. So they are described as new forms of government, and they are independent, but they do try to act in a role which is more than a convening role. They do try to inform policy directly. And in terms of some of the roles that they've taken over the years, I don't want to list all of them, but these are some of the key things that have really emerged from my evaluation of the work. And I just want to go through a few of them. They're really seen as ways of connecting and mobilising local actors. So on a commission, you may have representatives from the local council, you may have people from, say, we have Transport for North, we may have NHS on there, we may have the Environment Agency, we we have local community groups, we have school teachers, and they all have a different interest in climate change and galvanizing climate action. It should be said that they are there in a personal capacity, they're not there on behalf of their organisation, and that helps maintain the independence of the Commission. But then it also means that directly and indirectly, they will still be informing practices within their own organisations and be able to share understanding of what's happening else within the local area around climate change. They've been seen as really inclusive. They provide a voice to some actors who wouldn't necessarily have a voice on climate change at the local level. So it's a really important way to provide that space for inclusive discussion. And they help build a sense of common responsibility and ownership, so that any plans or actions that are outlined in a particular commission are co-produced by the commissioners. And it might also involve the commissioning of separate pieces of work to help inform those different action plans. And ultimately, just a final point, is really the sense of positivity that they create, the need, and Sam has alluded to this, that many of the stakeholders that are involved in these commissions are used to hearing about climate change, and that's often why they're on the commission. That's probably why most of you are in the room today, because we have some interest in climate change. But what we are also trying to do is, through those voices, to try and engage the hard-to-reach individuals and organisations who may not necessarily be inclined to sit on one of these commissions, but whose involvement is still nonetheless crucial. Now, moving on from the commissions, I wanted now to give you another example, which is more embryonic, and it's where we're trying to look at developing our work on adaptation. What happened with Pecan is we started doing all of the work, and about halfway through the project, we realised that much of what we were doing was very much focused on net zero, which was in alignment with what seemed to be happening at the local level. But we realised that there was a gap in terms of our work on adaptation and resilience, so we set up a new platform to focus on this. And this is actually something which has emerged in our evaluation, that some of the commissions are saying, we've been doing this from the outset, we're now starting to incorporate more work on adaptation, which is really positive. And this is crucial because both are needed to start galvanising climate action. And historically, adaptation tends to lag behind mitigation. We all know this. And adaptation tends to be framed more negatively, whereas a net zero story can help paint more of a positive vision of the future. And what we're trying to do through Pecan is not to conduct our adaptation work in parallel. We're trying to look at it in the context of mitigation. So we're trying to look at the integration of adaptation and mitigation when we're addressing different political issues. And communication plays a very important part in this. And the piece of research that we're doing at the moment is looking at heat and heat waves. I mean, although it's not the best weather today, some of you may remember that we had several heat waves over the summer. We didn't just have one. And this year was the first time ever that a temperature of over 40 degrees was recorded in the UK. And when it comes to the cost of overheating in the UK, this is predicted to rise significantly in 2050. And I just wanted to highlight the couple of images. Although this is improving, historically, a lot of the media tends to use images of people sunbathing or enjoying the sun when we're about to experience a heat wave or during a heat wave. And this is problematic and damaging because it further exacerbates and encourages people to continue to engage in practices that are actually quite harmful to them. So people going outside during the most, the hottest point of the day, for example. And we've done a little bit of analysis last week, or just over 10 days ago, the ONS and the UK Health Agency published their data on excess deaths around the 2022 summer heat waves. And what happened this year was that 2 records were broken. So there were more excess deaths on one day, so the 19th of July 2022, than any other day over the past 7 years. And that's in the context of the 18th and 19th of July being declared for the first time level 4 heat health warnings. And the second record that was broken is that there were more excess deaths, just over 2,000, during the period 10th of July to 20th of July. This has never happened before. This may be due to the length of that period, which has never been seen since 2016. There are a few caveats around this data. We're still waiting to get a little bit of data around the month of September, which might help with some of these figures. The deaths registered in 2018 to 2021 are actually based on finalised mortality data, whereas those registered this year are based on provisional mortality data. So there's a couple of caveats, and some of those figures may shift. But ultimately, we're seeing a shift in the significant climate impact, which isn't getting as much attention as it should, because much of the attention is focusing on net zero. So the way we're framing our research is around the fact that we are starting to get more evidence around the impacts of these heat waves, and we want to understand better what are the types of behaviours and actions that need to be shifted, and what are the types of behaviours and actions that need to be shifted, also bearing in mind their implications for mitigation. So we wouldn't want practices to be encouraged around installing AC systems without thinking about the emissions that might be associated around this. So the work that we're doing is looking at a range of areas across the UK. We want to map out the experiences and decision-making processes that took place this summer. So we're speaking to a range of stakeholders and decision-makers who were involved. We would then want to assess whether existing policies in the UK around heat are adequate in general, if they were adequate over the summer, and if they need to change in any way if the UK is going to experience any more 40-degree days. And then we want to try and inform government with some of these insights that we're going to be gathering. But it's important to note that this is not the first year we've experienced heat waves. We will experience more heat waves in the future. But past heat waves have had less excess deaths. But then going to the question of how we inform policy around this, well, our analysis at the moment shows that it's quite difficult to actually answer the question of who owns responsibility when it comes to responding or building resilience to heat waves. Now, this just gives you, the slide just gives you a few examples of the different policies, documents, strategies that have been published by government over the last few years. But as you'll notice here, you probably can't see, the departments who authored these reports are very varied. There's NHS England, there's the Climate Change Risk Assessment, there's BEIS, there's DEFRA, there's the Department of Education, Ministry of Justice, Department for Levelling Up. There are so many departments who've been involved in producing some sort of guidance that some of them only mention heat waves or overheating once, but they address it in some way. And there seems to be no coordinated effort to bring together work across the different departments. And this is where communication is really important, to highlight not only the importance of this issue and the need to act now, but also the relevance to the different government departments and the need for a cross-government coordinated approach. And so just to finish, really, to add to some of the points I made on communication and climate change, it's important to bear in mind that no one size or no one approach is appropriate for all audiences. And that cross-stakeholder involvement is required to ensure that there is a collaborative, but also a sync-up approach to address climate change. Thank you very much.
But we have, let me introduce you Alyssa, our next speaker. So Alyssa Gilbert, again, she's from the Grantham Research Institute, but based at Imperial College London, and she's Director of Policy and Translation. And so I think you are like really the person who tries to channel all the research on climate change, I think, in Imperial, but as well to policymakers and businesses. And Alyssa has been chairing the COP26 Universities Network, a nationwide network of academics and professionals working to deliver impact on climate change. And she also worked as a journalist in Brussels on environmental policy, and she worked also as a researcher in the Deputy Mayor of London. And she's also currently a member of the Natural Environment Research Council Advisory Network. So please, Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Maybe I'll do something a little bit more practical. So it was really great to hear from Sam and Candice already about the specific projects that they're doing and how they use those to have impact through communication. How many of you in here are academics? Okay, it looks like about half. And how many are students? And how many would like to categorize yourself as neither of those things? Okay, interested members of the public. Okay, great. So just to tell you a little bit about my job, because it's relevant in different ways to different people in the room. As was described, my job title is Director of Policy and Translation. Translation doesn't mean that I speak lots of different languages, which LinkedIn sometimes thinks that I get really interesting job offers, which I'm qualified. It means that I'm translating expertise and knowledge that you find in a university environment into a language that can be understood and a format that can be understood by people outside universities. Because within a university environment, and hopefully those of you that are academics or students recognize this, there's an incredible amount of knowledge. It's overwhelming. As a student, you get access briefly to this amazing knowledge, and as an academic, you get to immerse yourself and expand that knowledge all the time. But it's needed by people out there, desperately needed in the case of climate change. So being able to translate that in an effective manner is the job I've got, and it's a really fun job. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit with some examples about some of the things that I've done, but I hope that while you're listening to me speak, you're not just listening to this as like, here's some person and here's what they did. I want you to be thinking about what you can do. Hopefully that's why some of you are in the room thinking about the fact that you have some knowledge or communication skills. So if you have knowledge and communication skills, you're in the best position. If you have knowledge, you can develop communication skills. And if you have communication skills, you can find the knowledge and then communicate. So just find the right opportunity for you. So the job that I do is based in a university. So that leads to this question for me. What actually is the role for science? And by this, I mean natural sciences, engineering, but also social sciences, the kind of things Sam and Candice were also talking about, an understanding of things like policies, developing policies, economics, communications, history, culture, all of these things are relevant. How can we, what is the role for science in having an impact? Some of those roles are really quite direct. So Candice explained that the Place-Based Climate Action Project is a really direct, it's totally applied research, right? And you can see it's easier when you're on a project like that, sometimes not easier, but it could be easier to take your science and really use it directly. But at Imperial, I also work with people in the maths department. And they actually do things that are really, really relevant to climate change. So how can you help make sure that those people have an impact, as much of an impact as they can have? So there's direct roles, there's integrated roles. Some areas of research work with local government, but some work with international government. And then there's also another way in which that research can be applied. But also, it's really important that some of the knowledge that we have locked up sometimes too much in academic institutions are actually important background knowledge for people. So even in that model that you heard about local government, everybody who comes to that activity already has some knowledge in their head that informs the decisions they make. So how do they get that information? How do they get that knowledge? How can we make sure we're communicating and improving the basic level of understanding of all kinds of people with the information that we have? So all of these things are different ways that science can have an impact. So I'm going to start by saying some really boring things. They might be disappointing for you, because when you want to go and have an impact by communicating, you might want to just go do something really dynamic with it. But sometimes what you need to do is actually plan the impact you're going to have. And that sounds really dull, but it's actually really important. I ask a simple question: what are you trying to achieve? And it's really important to kind of know that before you start trying to communicate something. And when you think about the knowledge deficit model that was introduced by an earlier speaker, then it used to be that the idea was, I've got some knowledge, I'm going to share it with you, and then miraculously you will make the right decisions that I was hoping you would make. But actually that doesn't work. I mean, it might work for a few people, but in general it doesn't work. So what are you actually trying to achieve? Sometimes it can be local government policy. Sometimes you're trying to get public support. Sometimes you're trying to do something very specific. So the example Sam gave of the Oxford principles have been really powerful. So you could say there's this very specific problem I identified, and I want to tackle that problem, improve the process of that problem. Who do you need to speak to? Who are the people that your audience is that you want to communicate with? Who's the target market for your work? And who's responsible for those decisions? And by knowing all those things, you can improve your impact via your communications. And then what skills do you need? And what people do you need to surround yourself with or work with to achieve this impact? The reason why I have this picture here, hopefully some of you have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Some of of you heard of that organization? Some signs of life?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been publishing very in-depth reports about climate change for years, and they have been publishing something called the Summary for Policymakers. How many people have ever read the Summary for Policymakers? Okay, not all that many. I mean, to be honest, I don't recommend it for lots of reasons. I mean, it's quite good. I mean, technically it's really good. It's not a great read, partly because it's intensely depressing, but also, and you know it's accurate, so it's accurate and depressing, and then you know it's conservative, so that's even worse. But the other thing is that it's not really like the best book I've ever read, right? It's not well written, and even where the IPCC has been trying really hard to improve the way that it offers something, that information through, there's actually a disconnect between the way they present the information. And you'll hear from someone later who helps translate that really, really well for the people who could use it. So think about your audiences, plan your impact, and it sounds really boring, but if you are going to leave this room and think about how to use your knowledge of impact, really do some structured planning. And if you're not the kind of person who loves structured planning, find a structured project manager to work with you and do the planning for you. It will honestly make your impact much, much greater. And importantly in that process, understand what does success look like. Could be what success looks like, but maybe the outcome isn't just a load of people feeling really proud of themselves. Maybe the outcome is the kind of emissions reductions you get from policies like Sam described and quantified. So be really clear about what success looks like for you. Sometimes it's really hard to measure. In fact, often with communications and impact, it's very hard to measure that what you did had the impact. But think about that as you're doing your work. It might evolve, but really think about what does success look like? How can I measure that I'm doing things that are making a difference? Because it's a big problem, and if you're willing to put your energy into it, you want to put your energy into it as effectively as possible. One of the things that was mentioned earlier, which is something that has also changed recently, but I really recommend you thinking about if you're trying to have an impact with communications, is that communication itself is a science. And we're understanding more and more about how you communicate to have impact. And one of the things that I really like applying and thinking about is the values-based dimension, which is something that Candice also spoke about. I really recommend this organization, Climate Outreach, but it's one of several organizations that do active research on how you communicate effectively about climate change. And this piece of research that they did, called Britain Talks Climate, looks at different types of people in the UK and tries to understand how receptive they'll be and why to different kinds of conversations about climate change. And sometimes it's not always conversations about climate change itself, but conversations about the solutions to climate change that you want to understand, or conversations about issues like heat waves. So to build on that, I think it's really interesting, this thing about how do people respond and talk about heat waves. But if you follow the news, presumably some of you paid attention to the news before the news just became so ever-changing, no one could keep track of it. When you were following the news earlier in the summer, when there was this heat wave, hopefully some of you noticed this big backlash against comments about heat wave. Like, who are all these boring people who don't want to have fun in the sun? You know, and so there wasn't just a group of a sizable kind of group of people who didn't want to hear about the heat wave. They actually pushed back at it, right? They pushed back at the communication of it. So then understanding those different types of people and the groups that they're in will help you target your communication. So that helps with two things. It helps you identify your audience, understand how to receive your information, and target your communication really well at a specific group of people. But it also helps you anticipate who are those other groups of people. Are we leaving them aside? Are they going to actually be a problem in terms of my goals and objectives? So do a bit of planning and really think carefully and deeply. And you don't have to just think about it. You can read some stuff other people prepared already for you. So it's waiting for you to use it. Yeah, I'll skip this slide. I was going to give you some case studies of things that I've worked on that have been really impactful. This one isn't about climate specifically, but it's about environmental issue. This was a thing that I worked on at Imperial that I think, I know it had a lot of impact, but it had a lot of impact because we brought together several types of communication all at one time. So when you're planning what I just described, you should be planning, and you're planning eventually a communications campaign of sorts, think about all of the different dimensions that can reach your audience. So it might be one or two more audiences who are going to reach your different audiences, but you might want to reach them in different kinds of ways. So, because I work at university, everything actually starts with academic research at some point. So actually, the person who did the research that eventually helped contribute to actually the ban of single plastics in this country and in Europe, and I can show you the way in which his work had that impact, so that's real impact. All started with actually physics and some work on physics of understanding how ocean currents move. And then the first step of translating that was to create a website where you can actually, it still works, this website, Plastics Adrift. You can like click on a point in the ocean and say, if I dropped a plastic bottle here, it will show you where the plastic bottle will end up. And according to the physicists that I've spoken to, it's easy, so to speak, relatively easy to understand where the plastic bottle goes to. It's quite a bit more difficult to go somewhere and say, I found a plastic bottle here. Where did it come from? But it's not impossible. And so by using this website and various other things, what we were able to do was build up, I might describe it as an arsenal of evidence, but also some fun, right? So you could just go to this website and actually, this physicist, he used to like show rubber ducks, so you could plant a rubber duck. So it was all kind of fun and interactive, so people could find out information. But then with this, they made one specific, very impactful finding in relation to UK policymakers. And that finding was that if you go and ask the question, I've gone to a pristine part of the environment, I've gone to the Arctic, a pristine part of the Arctic, and I found a bottle, where did it come from? It was actually quite likely that it came from the UK. Now that one piece of evidence was suddenly really powerful and helped launch a big campaign about plastics, which was already, so this is the second part that you have to consider, have something that's engaging and relevant to people, but then also do it at the right time. And this was also a time when people were starting to become worried and more concerned about plastics. Then communicate it to people who can be change makers. So he went and he gave talks to all kinds of change makers. He spoke to all kinds of environmental NGOs, and he gave them a background briefing on the technical stuff. And then they went away and used that in a way that they felt most comfortable doing. Sometimes the way they presented that was not the way that I probably would have presented it, and certainly not the way that my physics colleague would have presented it. But taken together with what we then presented to policymakers and civil service, and what we presented in consultation to Parliament, and orally to Parliament, led to policy change. And in fact, some of the documents we created were copy-pasted. I was contacted by someone in the European Commission who then took a page of the briefing paper we wrote and asked if he could copy it into a page of a European Commission document. So through all of these different routes, a sense of timing, who can be your interlocutors, and creating a range of different materials, you can really have an impact. So plan it, and you can have that kind of impact. I'm going to just say a few more things, and then you probably want me to stop talking. So something else I've been involved in was setting up what was used to be called the COP26 Universities Network, and is now called UK Universities Climate Change Network. The reason I want to bring this up is about who you work with. So you might be surprised to find that people really like to collaborate when they have impact. And we built this network just before the UK had presidency of the International Climate Negotiations, COP26. And what we found was that if you speak to holders of academics who have a lot of expertise on climate about working together, even though they usually compete with each other for academic funding, when you give them an opportunity to have impact by collaborating together, they're all really keen to do it. And by collaborating and working together, we were able to amplify our voice. We had meetings directly with Alex Sharma. We gave briefings directly to groups of civil servants and to the presidency before they went to COP. We continue to be engaged with them, and through them, we're now engaged with the COP presidency in Egypt, and I've been to Egypt, and we've now co-delivered briefing papers to the Egyptian government with Egyptian academics. We've also worked with Egyptian academics who said to me when I was there 2 weeks ago, we had never written a policy briefing paper for our government. We didn't know this was a thing we could do. And one of them was like, I'm doing this again. I mean, and she was like totally addicted. And now that's not even, I mean, in our world here, that's like old fashioned, like policy briefing papers, who does that anymore? We do co-developed projects with our government. But it's really great to see how that we wouldn't have achieved that if we weren't all working together as a sector. Now, one of the things, I used to work quite closely with Sam when he was working at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, and my counterpart at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE is a guy called Bob Ward, who likes speaking with the public, and he for a long time was saying we should speak to the public. And at first I was very much in my lane, like our job is to help connect academics, policymakers. But I was soon convinced that politicians do not make decisions about things unless they think that people care about those things. I mean, sometimes they don't listen anyway, but then they only last 45 days. So what we started to do was we realized while we were using our evidence to produce something for policymakers, it was pretty efficient and easy to take the same evidence and translate it into something that was valuable for the public. So we created this thing, 9 things you can do about climate change. You can find it on the Imperial website. It's a little brochure, it's 9 things that you can do. What it does is it gives members of the public a choice. We just start with one. We took it out to the climate strikes, that's me, in a t-shirt I stole from our Welcome Day team at Imperial. And we found, we didn't even say we had material. We were walking through saying that we were experts and asked, you know, at a moment when there were people who cared about climate but didn't have access to knowledge, and we took a whole load of academics and PhD students out into the streets when there were climate strikes. And lots of people were coming up asking us really good, intelligent questions and really happy to have them answered. And they said, what can we do? And we're like, do some of these things. And we handed out loads. And an interesting statistic from Imperial. So we're quite a well-known university. We're also a university that was quite well-known in COVID pandemic for giving advice. And this is so you can compare the statistic, advice on COVID. But the single most downloaded thing from the Imperial College website is 9 things you can do about climate change. Not only is it the single most downloaded PDF, it's been downloaded about 400,000 times. The next most downloaded document was downloaded 10,000 times, and it was COVID research. Okay, so this is information that people want, and if you provide it in the right format, people still need this information and are looking for it. You can communicate in lots of different ways. So we have a prize, the Climate Art, the Grantham Art Prize, which we do every 2 years, trying to engage in a different way through art. This was in the arches of a railway in Glasgow. It was painted by an artist just before Glasgow COP. We did 8 of those in different parts of the country before COP. And if you look at them, it's like a quiz. If you find one of these somewhere in the country, there are 10 threatened local species visible on each of the murals, and each of them was a collaboration between a localish scientist and a localish artist. And each of those were designed by local school children. So there's lots you can do. I'm just going to finish on a maybe a slightly depressing note. I hope that's kind of energized you to think about how you can use communication with evidence in all kinds of different ways to influence all kinds of different people, bearing in mind how people respond. But sadly, we know it's not enough. I really like your statistics, Sam, about how far we've gone with policies and that we've reduced emissions the size of the US. But we know that despite all of this communications, there's still far to go. So please be creative, be thoughtful, do the boring planning part, but also connect with each other and do communicate about both climate change, but also its solutions in a way that connect.
We have the coffee break now, so we can have 10 minutes of coffee break. So she's a colleague of mine at the School of Business and a member of the Center for Globalisation Research. She's a lecturer in digital economy, and she's also, very importantly, a co-founder and CTO of a company, Deep Planet, which she'll tell us a lot about. And she has a computer science background, and she really works on AI, machine learning tools applied to climate change issues. So, Natalia, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes. Let's say.
Okay. Thank you very much for kind introduction, Caterina. Thank you very much for being here. Hopefully, everyone is awake and well caffeinated, so you will have a chance to sleep during my talk. So we had a chance to learn about communications of climate emergency to policymakers, to governments, to members of public, to individual people. They don't know how to do simple steps to avoid climate change. But often this communication is not enough to implement very, very, very fast solutions that can help people immediately. So Deep Planet is working in sustainable agriculture. So as you know very well, that agriculture contributes a lot to climate change. It's polluting, it produces a lot of greenhouse gases, it wastes a lot of resources, it contributes to damage of forests, damage of soil, loss of fresh water, and so on. So our task was to communicate these problems to people who actually do this, to farmers, and to help them implement simple solutions which are based on academic research to help mitigate these negative effects of climate change and do some climate change adaptation. So we work on 4 main research fields. So we work in precision agriculture, water scarcity, forest preservation, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. So these 4, let's say, sustainable goals are very, very closely related, and you cannot take care about one without taking care about another. So we do research in these 4 directions, and we try to communicate these problems in all these 4 fields to the farmers. And this is a very, very challenging task. So our clients and people who are working with belong to one of 3 categories. So these are farmers or growers. They can be small and medium growers. They can be very large farmers that have fields across the globe in multiple continents. They can be very, very large organizations. We work with essential oils company who has operations in every continent, for example. We work also with agricultural associations. It means that there is a big community of people who make policy suggestions on behalf of farmers, and they work with farmers to help implement some climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. And we also work with NGOs. So all these 3 stakeholders have very different types of operations and very different interests. So we need to address them in a very different way, and we need to communicate the problem and the solution to each of them in very, very different ways as well. So I will be speaking today about a few use cases and a few different types of clients. So there will be wine growers, 1 agricultural association, and 1 NGO. And I will just outline a few problems that emerge from communication with them. Yeah? So essentially what we do, we work in crop monitoring. So we essentially do soil moisture prediction, irrigation forecasting. We look at deforestation and make suggestions about reforestation where it's possible. And we also work on regenerative grazing. Yeah, so we try to use AI and climate models to implement these solutions. So here is a very, very rough outline of what we do. I won't go into technical details. This slide just intends to illustrate that we use quite complex method. We use different types of satellite imagery combined with AI and machine learning tools to provide solutions to growers and farmers across the globe. We currently have operations on 4 continents. We work with Africa, we work with Australia, we work with Europe and Asia and North Americas. And each continent poses different problems. But I would say the communication problems are very, very similar across the globe. And it's very, it really doesn't matter where you work. So working with growers is very homogeneous across the whole planet. And together with satellite imagery, we use a lot of ground data. We work with a lot of laboratories to collect ground samples to inform our models, to inform decision-making for agricultural actors, say agricultural associations. So we are also working on drones and UAV imagery, but mostly we provide time series and computer vision solutions. Essentially, it's an AI-based platform that you can log in and you can see some type of monitoring. So, yeah, we have developed a variety of AI models, but I will go straight to the use case. So this is a case of agricultural associations. So this is a project with Wine Australia. This is a very large organization that works with all the wine growers in Australia, and it provides recommendations on the country level on how to adapt to climate change. Yeah. So what we do, we look for the crop fields. In this case, we use machine learning to find where the wine grows, find the vineyards, and use some predictions like combine satellite imagery with weather data to predict, or rather display, frost events, heat waves, to understand what is the effect of these frost events or hail or heat wave on the crops, and what farmer needs to do now to be prepared for the effects of this climate event when it will be time to harvest, or if there is something they can do now to mitigate the impact of this negative event before the harvest and try to recover the crops before then. Yeah, so in this case, what's the problem of communicating this solution? This requires a lot of work on AI side and a lot of work on satellite imagery side. So it's a lot of resources, and the predictions of this is based on AI, not always 100% reliable. There is accuracy rate at about 96%, and it involves a lot of work to explain farmers what, in this case, association, what is the model doing. So it requires a lot of education of the farmers. It requires a lot of back and forth communication and negotiation, what can be done to display these negative effects and what can be done to mitigate the effects. And it really is a dialogue, a constant dialogue while you're implementing the project when you're developing the product itself. So there are very few solutions up to date which are already developed and ready to be distributed on the shelf. So all these projects are unique, developed for the particular customer or for the group of customers. Yeah, and to explain the customer that the tool is useful, you need to wait essentially for a year. So you will go to Australian Law Association and say, I have this amazing tool, it's based on academic research, and it will give you some benefit in a year's time, but please pay us today. And this is a very difficult problem. And obviously farmers do not read scientific papers. Unfortunately, we would like them to, but no one agrees. So it takes a lot of persuasion and demonstration, like looking backwards to show them, okay, this last year we've done this, and here is the effect, and this is how it will be covered in your case. So farmers, they don't really care about academic research. It's very sad, but what they want to see is immediate effect. Show me how it works. Okay, there are very little climate change solutions that can work now that we can show, right? So what you can do in this case? So we can take some backwards-looking data, which is not very long. We have decent satellite imagery for about maybe 6-7 years on a level, on a resolution that is useful for farmers. Yeah. Before that, we have a 30 kilometer per pixel resolution, which is like country level useful, but like grower who grows potatoes, he won't see anything because it's just whole field is in 1 pixel. This is useless information for them. So this is the imagery we have for 5-7 years, and we cannot really observe serious climate effect in 5 to 6 years. So we need to change to look for these anomalies and to show them, okay, here's your vineyard. You see, in 2012 there was a huge heat wave on this part, and there was a huge frost event in that part. And if you would have done something to mitigate this event, you would have this kind of positive effect on your crops. So it's a little bit of trying to show them that something works, which doesn't really work yet. So it's a very, very difficult process. But at the same time, they want to know what can be done, right? So a few other cases that can be helpful in this discussion, soil moisture prediction. So soil moisture prediction per se is not a very tricky task. Most of the growers, they have soil moisture sensors, and they can monitor the soil moisture in the field just looking at the sensors. But what is the problem with this? Is that they can observe previous period they can observe soil moisture measurements on a few locations. So, for example, in the center, you can see where the soil moisture sensors are installed. But in between these points, you cannot have any readings of soil moisture. So you cannot really install effective dynamic irrigation system which will minimize water usage. Yes, what you need is a very detailed representation of the underground soil up to 2 meters down the ground. And you need to have it in 3D, so the farmers can rotate it and see what exactly is happening in each part of their field and how it's evolving over time, and what we can do, how we can irrigate, do precision irrigation just to show precision irrigation just to improve this particular small piece of land which is not well irrigated for some reason, and how we can minimize usage of water overall in their farms. Yeah. Another useful things that farmers are interested in and that can be really helpful is, as I mentioned already, yield prediction based on the historical weather events during the growing season, how it changes, what happens if there is wind during blossoming season, what there is a heat wave during ripening season, what is the best date harvest. For example, in wine industry, it's very important to harvest exactly on the day when the grapes reaches perfect maturity and the sugar level, which is called in wine industry Blomer level, when it reaches its peak and when it needs to be harvested. And all the logistic operations of all the large vineyards are tied to this information. Manual monitoring of this kind of agricultural crops is very difficult because vineyards are very, very large, and monitoring precisely what's happening in each row, each block, it's very difficult. So what we do, we provide these kind of maturity maps and yield maps that all look very similar. It just says for each pixel of the vineyard, what is current predicted yield based on current circumstances and based on the historical date, what is current maturity and what is predicted maturity, and when and how much they will harvest. Yeah. So again, this is a matter of trust. People don't trust researchers for unknown reason, and they don't believe in academic research. They need to see exactly how it works. Show me that this thing works. I don't know all these climate models, these academic papers, I don't care. I need to know that if I pay, I don't know, $15 per my vineyard per year, I will get exactly the prediction that will be useful to me. Yeah. So what do? We ask farmers, okay, give us a little bit of our data. We call it yield challenges or maturity challenges. Give it like retrospectively for any year you like, and we will make predictions. And if we're right, then you can think whether you should subscribe to our service. Yeah, so it requires this conversation with them. Yeah, and many of them do try this. It's free, right? And everyone who tries, they essentially subscribe, because this provides them a tool to predict this. And prediction of these sugar level, harvest dates, and other parameters is very important to reduce the waste of the crops, to reduce the cost of logistics operation, to reduce the cost of resources in general, which is very important in the current circumstances and in general for all the growers. Yeah. Another use case on deforestation monitoring. So what's happening here? This is a big essential oil company which has operations in multiple continents, but here we're looking at Somaliland, and they're growing frankincense trees and harvesting frankincense oil in Somaliland. The problem in Somaliland is that you cannot really monitor what's happening on the ground unless you have a couple of trucks with arms and with you. So there is a ongoing war conflict in the zone, and the only way they can monitor it is with satellite imagery. So what we did in this project, we look at this part of land and we try to find individual trees. We use 3 types of satellite imagery here with different resolution. And we use machine learning models to find the trees, to detect different species of the trees, to look at the trees specifically that we're interested in, which are frankincense trees, to count the trees, whether all the trees are alive each year, how they've been harvested. Do we need to contact anyone if our network of people who are gathering these frankincense oils? Usually it's tribe women for whom this is the only income, and they go and gather this frankincense oil, a certain amount of frankincense oil every year. And they not necessarily can monitor how much they gather, whether they over-harvested and so on. So we need to do it yearly, this monitoring, to help the company understand what is happening with the trees that they are harvesting from. Yeah. And finally, last case I want to mention is regenerative grazing. This is another big problem in agriculture when excessive use of cattle in the fields destroys soil, and we need to use some monitoring to move the cows between the grazing grounds in a way that is useful, that will minimize damage to the land, that will minimize interference with wildlife, that will minimize negative effects for the local population, and so on. So this is a case of Masai Mara Conservancy in Kenya. And this is a very large piece of land. It's very difficult to monitor, even with a team of rangers and trucks that are driving across the lands. So the project we've been doing with them is trying to monitor with satellite imagery. This is European Space Agency satellite imagery. Monitor all their grounds, predict which part of the conservancy is suitable for grazing, where they can move their cows, where the cows won't interfere with wildlife, because this is a conservancy, there's a lot of wildlife there. How to increase the amount of cows that they can graze maximally to benefit local population, and at the same time preserve the rangeland, to preserve the conservancy as well. So a few things that we've done here. This was mostly about understanding the temporal changes of biomass and other biometric parameters such as plant density, grasslands and shrublands biomass, forest biomass, overgrazing, and in general logics of automated recommendations how to move cows between different parts of the conservancy in a sustainable way, as sustainable as possible. Now, this is something they've been looking at. So over time, you see that here's changing forest biomass, grassland biomass, and overgrazing. Yeah, so there is a simple AI-based system of recommendations how to move strategically cows between the blocks. It looks a little bit complex just for grazing of the cows, but think about this way. So in future, we will need to increase the pastures as much as we can, and need to decrease the negative effects as much as we can. So this is a minimum that we can do for all types of farmers to let them know what is happening, because in many cases they don't know, and to help them make these informed decisions. So we don't propose to substitute the decision making as, okay, I will tell you what to do. No, it's just a little bit of information, what is happening in reality, and what will happen if you make this or that decision. Yeah, similar to this, we're looking at the nutrients composition of the soil, where so this is about fertilizers and nutrients, what is happening off the ground, and so on. So I don't go too much through that. Yeah, another feature that we're currently looking at seems to be very interesting for all the stakeholders. I want to overemphasize the importance of the carbon monitoring. So we work in two directions, above ground biomass and organic soil carbon. So these two are very important for helping farmers to get credits for carbon storage if they use their land sustainably. And this is not something we came up with. This is something we have developed when farmers came to us. Okay, we have this yield prediction, and so it's all very nice, but we need additional income. What you can do to help us implement that? Yes, and that's what we're currently working on. So this is a digital twin of the vegetation on the ground. This is a research project that we're working in collaboration with some robotics researchers. And this is also a case of organic soil carbon. We predict from satellite imagery with the help of soil probes, so we have historical data. What should we do? We don't know. So this is a little bit of something that we can do to help them be informed about what is happening. Yeah, so this is kind of picture they see on the portal, and it essentially says that it's a lower carbon content on the lighter parts and a little bit higher content on the darker parts. There's a lot of scientific research under that. Just to sum up, there are a few challenges that we face on our day-to-day communication with the farmers. And first and foremost is very, very long growing cycles. So it takes a lot of time for farmers to see the benefit. Even we can do some predictions retrospectively, for them actually to make some actions, it will be the whole growing season probably. We need to demonstrate that technology actually works. They don't believe academic research. And we need to educate them about how this technology works and how they can actually understand what's happening through this nice picture that we're showing them. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have our last speaker, last but not least, so Leo Hickman. Is the director and editor of Carbon Brief, and you served 16 years, also writing The Guardian, editor and writer of The Guardian, and you've been awarded many times, but recently won the Editor of the Year 2020. Since you don't remember, no, by the British Association of Science Writers, and you wrote several books, so we are, I cut it short. I'm looking forward to hear your insights.
Thank you. Just to check on timing, are we okay?
No.
We're bad. Okay, so I'll try and be quick. I know that obviously everyone wants to ask some questions to the panel, so I'll try and speak through.
Okay. I think 15 minutes.
Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is split this in two. I'm going to begin with just some very, very quick, hopefully, reflections on my time as a journalist, probably about 25 years, but particularly in the last 2 decades of reporting and writing about climate change. My experience is obviously UK newspapers. My background is from The Guardian. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about Carbon Brief, which is the website I currently edit, which is a very specialist website on climate change, with very, very different types of communication for different audiences and different styles of journalism. Okay, we're going to go back more than 20 years. We're going back to 1990 now. So this is a front page from the Times, as you can see, from May. I don't know, everyone at the back, can you see? Probably can't see that. But this is Margaret Thatcher, so kind of topical, you know, female Tory leaders on scene today. So this is kind of an interesting moment, because this is probably one of the first times that climate science made it to the front page of a UK national newspaper. So this is the moment when the very, very first IPCC report had been published, and it's the kind of political response to that. It's as you can see, Thatcher sets tough global warming target, and this is a picture of her in front of the Hadley Centre, which I think was then near Reading, but is now obviously in Exeter with the Met Office. So a kind of interesting moment, and I tweeted about this a while back. And actually another little interesting thing of note is you've got Trippier to boost Tory's green image. So you've got kind of quite a few things going on there. You've got a political leader responding to climate science, and then if you think how long ago that was, 32 years ago, and scientists basically saying climate change is a thing, it's a problem, we need to act as in a societal way. And at the very same time, so let's look at the dates, May 26, 1990, This is the Daily Mail, and it is April the 18th, 1990. So just a few weeks before then. And this is the very, very first example of what I would describe as a climate skeptic comment piece in a newspaper in the UK. I think this is the very first example. We talked about it earlier about, I think Sam, you brought out that slide at the very, very beginning showing you the different responses, societal responses. Some people pushing back against climate action, some people really, really strongly arguing for it. So in the media, which is, I guess, kind of my domain, you've long had this sort of fault line between the skeptics and the people sort of pushing for action. And actually, this is a really interesting article. I mean, I can share these slides later. I don't think you won't find this online because I had to drag this out of the archives. But if you break that article down, you see the absolute playbook for how these articles are constructed to sort of try and undermine the science using a kind of slightly sort of dark money think tank with experts associated with it who try and go 50-50 against the scientists. So you get, I'll bring it up in a minute, this thing called false balance, which I'm sure a few of you have heard before, which is a very big problem in the media. It still is, not quite as bad as it was. But this dynamic that we're trained as journalists to give both sides of the story, which is a kind of slightly sort of naive, simplistic way of normally telling, if you go into the street and you interview people, you would try and get a range of people with a range of views, and you kind of hope as a journalist, the composite of those views gives you a sort of a truth, if you like, which is obviously a very, very flawed way of thinking about it. But with science, where the vast majority of scientists, not believe, that's a horrible word, but they accept the foundation of climate science, and they think that human-caused emissions are having this impact. You then, as a journalist, traditionally for 30-odd years, have then gone and interviewed the scientists, and then you've gone and interviewed someone who counteracts that. So you've had this dynamic playing around in the media for a long time. This is a rather extreme example. This is the front page of the Daily Express from about 10 years ago. A sample of 3 months worth of front pages, just to give you a sense of just how obsessed some newspapers are with certain stories. So these are Daily Express front pages, focusing in on extreme weather. So that it was a period of, I think, early 2014 when we had all those sort of Somerset floods and things in the UK, which had a big political impact because you saw lots of politicians walking around in Wellington boots in the flood in Somerset fields. But this is to sort of highlight that there's a commercial interest and a kind of formula that many media outlets and newspapers follow. They know that when they put, say, Princess Diana on the front page, they'll sell, their sales will go up 17%. They also know the Daily Express, if you put extreme weather events on the front page, sales go up by X%. So they just hit that formula over and over and over again. Coming up to, so this is 2009, December 2009. This front page was extraordinary at the time, but this wouldn't happen now, I don't think. So whatever it is, almost 13 years later, you would not get, I think, a front page of a national newspaper doing something so explicitly climate skeptic in that way. 100 reasons why global warming is natural. No proof that human activities have been kind of an absolutely extraordinary front page. Just a quick one, sorry, I'm scooting through these, I know we want to get on to the Q&A bit. So this is 2014. This goes back to the idea I had about false balance. And this is a story where BBC staff were told to stop inviting cranks onto science programs. Broadcast media, which is not my background, but broadcast media is particularly guilty of false balance. You can all think of panel debates you've seen late night on TV on a news show or something, where you'll have 2 or 3 experts, and they want that angry dynamic. That's what makes good television. You want people arguing and sort of shouting at each other or disagreeing. So this has really been a problem for climate science in particular, where you've often had a climate science up against a politician, often a skeptical politician, because the TV producers want to create that dynamic. So in terms of going back to the fundamental of why we're all here to discuss communicating climate change, that's always been a huge sort of anchor or drag on the way that this gets communicated to the public. And obviously mass media is is crucial. TV is particularly important still to communicating anything, but particularly climate change. Way more important than, say, print media, because that's effectively sort of dying out now, really, as a form of communication. And even online, which is where I now kind of work in terms of social media and things, it's still, the visual medium is still very, very important. I'm going to kind of keep whizzing through some front pages here. The Guardian, my old newspaper, a front page here from 2014. This was from the Somerset floods again. So putting Nicholas Stern, a climate economist who did a big landmark report, when was that, 15 years ago or something? The Guardian inviting someone like that to do a front page is actually really, really unusual, particularly for the Guardian. And then you've got a front page here from this year. Again, a very, very striking front page, revealed carbon bombs set to trigger a climate catastrophe. Almost going back to Sam's point about you can get two extremes on either end. You get kind of the climate emergency, we're all going to die in 12 years kind of headline, which is that's of that ilk, versus the dismissal kind of line, which is like, let's not bother, let's not act, this is going to hurt our economy, this is too inconvenient. These are both from 2018. So there was you can remember there was an extreme heat wave, as we heard from Candice this summer. But in 2018 was also a very, very important summer for a heat wave in terms of the media and public reaction to it. And this is The Sun, which is, even to this day, is pretty skeptical, to be honest. Its editorials are still very kind of hostile to climate action. But kind of an extraordinary, I think this will become, it already is quite an iconic front page for something like The Sun. The world's on fire. I think it was extraordinary, not particularly for the visually striking front page, but if you turn to page 2 and read the story, continued the story, it quoted a climate scientist. So Len Shaffrey, who I think is at Reading University, global temperatures are increasing due to climate change. A very, very simple statement by an authority figure like a scientist. We haven't really talked about that today, about who to the public, who are the trusted authority figures. And polling still shows that science, despite some of the stuff that we heard in COVID, I think scientists are still highly, highly trusted in terms of communication. And people like me, journalists and politicians, are utterly not trusted. So that's something to bear in mind about when communicating to the public. Don't forget that scientists are still highly trusted. And then you've got the big rival, the big left-wing rival, Daily Mirror, running another kind of almost to the Sam's point again, a kind of a very, very kind of almost alarmist front page. Time is running out to save planet. But crucially, coming from David Attenborough, another probably one of the most trusted authority figures in polling repeatedly shows this, that David Attenborough is probably one of, if not the most trusted voice in this country for anything, but particularly for around climate change. Then, fast forward, you can see me having a bit of a joke from when I'm tweeting this, but a ridiculous situation this summer during the heat wave where the Daily Mail, within 24 hours, did the kind of yin and yang kind of ridiculous kind of, so day one, calling everyone a snowflake and, what on earth is Britain getting in a kind of fuss about, this is nothing. The very next day, nightmare of the wildfires, hottest ever day, kind of, you almost think, are they taking their readers for idiots that they wouldn't have remembered 24 hours before? But kind of interesting, because the heat wave, I don't know if Candice and others have done some studies on this yet, but it feels like this particular heat wave of this summer really was an interesting moment for the kind of culture wars that we hear about, where you had definitely some people communicating, as you said, sort of really trying to actively push back and downplay this kind of extraordinary moment of the UK symbolically going over, well, not actually going over 40 degrees C, and people really coming quickly, particularly columnists and sceptical newspapers like the Daily Mail, rushing out to put out political and politicised commentary to try and downplay that impact. This is, I brought this up just to make the point that has already been made today, really, about the use of imagery on stories around heat waves. So this is the Daily Mail actually back to the heat wave in 2018. Britain's in meltdown. You've got these sort of striking sort of slugs at the top. Rail lines buckle. Sun cream is running out, and yet you've got another little picture there of people eating, again, kind of trusted, known people in sort of, big public figures having a nice ice cream, so it's that kind of mismatch of imagery. This is something that the University of Colorado in Boulder do. If you go onto their website, you can go, this is really interesting, you can go to different countries around the world to see how. So this is UK newspaper coverage of climate change and global warming since 2000. And it shows you the peaks and troughs. The reason I brought this up is you can clearly see what are the moments that really get the media's interest and therefore arguably the public's interest in climate change. So, and different countries have different, different trend lines and plots and peaks and troughs. You look at the US one, sometimes I've brought up the US one, I don't have time to do that. But you've got, so end of 2009, you've got the Copenhagen summit, was a little peak. You've got AR4 and Al Gore, the IPCC and Al Gore winning the Nobel Prize, and there being moments around there. If you look at the US one in 2005, you'll see a big peak around Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans, and where there was a very, very fleeting kind of moment of media interest in climate change. Then you've got the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015. And then you've got the heat wave of 2018 phasing in, you see how wide that is, phasing into the IPCC publishing later that autumn the landmark 1.5 degree report that they did, which had a huge knock-on impact into the whole, in early 2019, of Extinction Rebellion, the climate school strikes, Greta Thunberg, all of that kind of bleeding into one kind of bigger moment of interest. And really kind of caught the UK media's interest. And particularly that, I don't know if you remember that Easter period, that April of 2019, when Greta was actually in London, Extinction Rebellion were on the bridges and things, and there was a really extraordinary moment that then directly, I think, led to Theresa May not ramping up the net zero kind of legislation just before, again, we're back to Tory leaders losing power, but just before she was kind of taken out of power, she then took the UK's 2050 target from 80% up to 100%. Then we've obviously got, I think you can probably guess that that's COP26 in Glasgow, that's the highest moment. But you've also got COVID happening, so suddenly the media diverting and being interested in COVID, understandably. And then you've got a huge drop, a very, very predictable drop-off after COP26. You've got a little bit of kind of Ukraine war, cost of living, other things that would obviously inevitably dominating media interest. But interestingly, picking back up again pretty quickly with the heat waves this summer. Again, go and look on that website. I don't know if you probably can't see the URL there. I think it's nicocolorado.eu, but it's actually pretty interesting. It's quite a crude metric. All it's doing is analysing the term climate change and global warming within media articles, but it's still quite interesting. Just very, very quickly about Carbon Brief. So talked about Glasgow and COP26. This is just my team, both having dinner across the couple of weeks we were there, and then in our little booth in the media zone. And what we do is, so there's about 15 to 20 of us in the team. Most of us are based in the UK, but we have international colleagues as well. We have we're very specialist website in the fact that we are kind of a bit like a bridge between academic and mainstream media, and our audience is very important to understand, or for us, but just in terms of explaining what we do. So our audience tend to be people who are already somehow professionally interested in their day-to-day lives in climate change. They tend to be civil servants, academics, other journalists are vitally important audience for us, NGOs, etc. And what we try and do is we're known for what we call explainer journalism. So we don't publish any comment pieces, any editorials, we don't have a line, we don't have a policy position, we're not pro or anti-fracking or whatever, or nuclear in our writing. But we just try to explain as clearly as we can in plain English what the latest science is saying. So we cover a lot of new scientific papers and developments. And we explain what's happening kind of in policy developments. So for example, we will go to Egypt quite soon, and then we'll do a great big article summarising what happened at COP27. We did the same for all previous COPs. We do a lot of data visualization. It's a bit of a low res version, sorry about that, but this effectively in one quick image shows you the story of coal globally. So these are the world's nearly 10,000 coal plants visualized in one global map. And the size of the circles represents the capacity of each plant. But the colors are the most important thing, because they show you whether the coal plant is being phased down and closed, or whether it's being commissioned and being built. So you can see the story in Europe, where we're generally moving away from coal due to the colouring. You can see the story in China, India, elsewhere. And that's an interactive map on our website. It's one of our most popular articles. We published it for the first time about 5 years ago, and we update it with new data every year. And it's still regularly, in fact, I was at a meeting this morning in Chatham House about China's climate policy due to a book launch that was taking place. And one of the slides brought up was taken from the map, because it very, very quickly shows you a lot of detail and lets you kind of play around with the data as well. So we do a lot of charts. You probably know or see my colleague Simon Evans on Twitter. He's had a really successful year this year in particular, just tweeting charts basically, just doing quite quick fire charts to show an interesting insight, a factoid, a stat, whatever. And they have huge pickup. It's extraordinary how we had one. He did some analysis earlier this year which showed that currently with gas prices so high, that offshore and solar are 9 times cheaper to generate electricity at the moment than gas prices. And that little kind of factoid, 9 times, went completely kind of off into its own kind of dimension. Boris Johnson mentioned it in his outgoing speech. Keir Starmer mentioned it in his speech at the Labour Party conference the other day. Caroline Lucas has tweeted it. Kwasi Kwarteng, Ed Miliband. Across the political kind of stripes, people have been kind of using that. We find that's actually very potent, particularly on social media. People like to tweet and share. It's actually an animation. It actually plays out. It shows you how the longer we've left it, the cliff edge has got steeper and steeper and steeper. If we'd acted on climate change back in 1990, when we saw that Margaret Thatcher front page on the Times, the descent or the transition to net zero could have been much smoother, but we just left it so late that cliff edge is getting here, which is just kind of nuts for us, because we're just a little specialist website that don't have anywhere near that kind of reach. But it's a good example of how when our content can be picked up and used by other big influencers and just go off its own sort of journey. Like who knows who saw that? I mean, we have no idea, but all we know is it's been seen by many, many people. This is another good example. So Leonardo DiCaprio tweeted one of our articles, which again, we had no idea that this was happening. So I woke up one morning, looked at Twitter and saw all these messages saying, "Leo, will you marry me? Leo, I love you." And I thought, well, that's quite flattering. But then I realised it was actually directed at Leonardo DiCaprio. And being in his mentions is kind of a weird experience, kind of seeing all of that going on. But kind of an amazing moment really for us is actually still another very, very popular article for us. Effectively just a very simple journalistic exercise where we read 70 peer-reviewed studies, pulled out all the key stats around what the different impacts would be for crop yields or water or whatever it might be. We just presented it in a 3-column table, but in a nice interactive environment. And by repackaging, peer-reviewed literature in a different way, kind of in a much more for a sort of mainstream sort of diet, if you like, it kind of then just kind of ballooned and went off on this other journey. And I don't know, it kind of, in terms of what we're talking about today, kind of, in terms of communicating climate change, it shows that you you can bridge out of some of this amazing kind of research and studies that we've been hearing about, and we've got some amazing sort of academic colleagues here speaking and in the audience, and how we take those insights and how we sort of throw them out into kind of the ether, if you like, to get traction and to get impact, and hopefully get some policy response ultimately, because all the speakers today have spoken about different ways into kind of trying to get someone to pull that policy lever in a positive way. And that's it. So I'm just gonna, email me or get me on Twitter if you want to get any of those slides, but maybe I don't know if the organisers will send that around. But thank you, and hopefully we can have a good session now with some questions.